Hey folks, Seth here. As we watch cities burn, statues being torn down, and calls to defund the police, if you haven't already, it may be time to think about personal protection. Guns Etc. has 10,200 square feet of guns, ammo, safes, and a staff that will work with you to find the best firearm for your situation. So stop by their huge store in Mesa or click on gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $400 million in firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy July 21st, 2020. Portland, Oregon, like Seattle, Washington, the pre-2020 image of just those cities' names would conjure up not only where they are, but what they are. Pacific, beatific, blissfully happy, serene, irenic cities. San Francisco may have had the possession of that imagery once, but it's been long gone. And of course, thinking of these cities, one might want to put Chicago in the mix. Not that it shares much in common image-wise with Portland or Seattle or San Francisco. It is a major urban city, but it was considered part of the Midwest, and if one is old enough, one can recall how placid it appeared. For example, in the opening scenes and theme of the old Bob Newhart show in the 1970s. Well, these cities and others are on fire now. Rainbows and water have been replaced with stones, guns, and fire. If you want to learn about what's going on in, say, Portland, and you put the words Portland and riots in your search bar, your first headlines are The Disgrace of Portland, The Mess in Portland, and Portland, Oregon, police declare Saturday gathering a riot after another night of protest and unrest. That last headline is from the USA Today story, and it opens this way, quote, police declared a gathering Saturday night a riot after hundreds of demonstrators who have been protesting in the city since the death of George Floyd broke into a building and set it ablaze and started dumpster fires. The protesters broke into the Portland Police Association at around 10:45 p.m. Saturday, police said, and ignited a fire inside. That prompted police to declare the event a riot due to the violent conduct of the large group, creating a grave risk of public alarm, close quote. Lighting the police association building on fire, you bet. Now, Portland is run by a progressive Democratic mayor. It had a female chief of police and now has an African-American male chief of police. There are 4 members of the city council called commissioners, all Democrats. One is an African-American woman. The governor is a woman and a Democrat. Both its United States senators are Democrats. It has 5 members of Congress, 4 out of the 5 Democrats. And Oregon's state legislature is majority Democrat in the House and in the state Senate. It's effectively a single-party state, and Portland is certainly a single-party city. But what's the big problem if you listen to any of the leadership there? It is, after all, 52 days of straight riots. The big problem is Donald Trump, for he sent Department of Homeland Security officers in to help quell the riots. As the New York Times reports today, quote, Democrats said the president was the one out of control. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon said he would introduce legislation to limit the role of federal agents in the city of Portland. This isn't just an Oregon crisis, he said. It's an American crisis. We need to stop Trump before this spreads. He added, we won't let these authoritarian tactics stand. Someone wrote, why does the president think he can occupy cities? I liked the tweet today that said, I'm very interested in this theory that the president has no authority to respond to violent riots in American cities, particularly around federal property, but apparently should announce a nationwide mask mandate and enforce that. I suppose when words lose their meaning, people can write such ridiculous things as the president is occupying his own country. Now, the riots are purportedly over the killing of George Floyd, and at this point, almost 2 months after that dread event, and an equally almost same amount of time since the officers implicated in his death have been arrested and charged with various counts of homicide, one has to assume the riots are actually over something much different. We spoke earlier of Harvard professor Edward Banfield writing about urban riots and calling them riots mainly for fun and profit. He wrote, according to one summary, that there are 4 types of riots. Rampages, where young men are simply looking for trouble and act out violently. Pillaging, where theft is the main focus, and the riot serves as a solution for a type of collective action problem for thieves. 3, righteous indignation, where people act against an insult against their community. And 4, demonstrations, which are neither spontaneous nor violent, but instead designed for a specific political purpose. Let us admit frankly and upfront, all of these reasons have at base the same root at the core of moral philosophy and politics: how to adapt and adopt public policy in the city, or the polis. As Hadley Arkes wrote in his study of urban politics, the city in America has lost its sense of obligation. Obligation to one another, and obligation to the city's larger role in American public life. What is lost is the notion of the city as a polis, or a sense of community. What has driven once beautiful places, the broad shoulders reputation of Chicago, or the pacific nature of Seattle, or the beatific image of Portland, into the ditch of Gotham? It's not anything uncontemplated by our nation's founders. Of course, they are the last source of information most want to redound to, after having been run down for years as dead white males. Now add racist. But before the education system's group libel and slander of our founders, we knew more of what they wrote, and we were better off for it. James Madison would have been the expert on all this, especially his teachings in the 10th Federalist paper, where he wrote of the very problem we see right now. He called it faction. He defined faction as, quote, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community, close quote. Call it the impulse of passion or interest, it matters not, though I think this is the rule of passion. But that is what we are seeing now erupting in the cities. Now, Madison said there are 2 ways to control factions: removing its causes or controlling its effects, their causes or their effects. And there were 2 ways to remove the causes. The first by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, the same interests. Young James Madison would go on to write, quote, it could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, destroying liberty, that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to annihilate air. You cannot do it. Air is essential, after all, to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So you can't destroy liberty. He wrote the second expedient, giving everyone the same opinions and interests, was as impractical as the first. For as he wrote, quote, as long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. So then how do you control the effects of passion? Madison asks. If the faction is a minority, politics, voting majorities, solves the problem. But what if the faction is a majority? Well, then you expand the sphere to limit its power, and you ensure Republican forms of government that can protect the rights of minorities that you do not achieve what is known as a tyranny of the majority. Republican forms such as ours, John Adams would argue, with tripartite separations of power, would be able to protect minorities. But now, today, all these wheels have come off the cart. And we suffer from all kinds of tyrannies, or unjustly directed passions, as Madison would have put it. In large part, one can attribute this to a lack of civic education, a lack of civic love, and a lack of respect for the separation of powers. It's been taking place for some time. There are so many examples to choose from, but just today, the notion that the president can be an occupier by trying to enforce law. Think about this. In a city where rioters threatened federal courthouses and took down statues of 2 of our most famous founders, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. But I suppose when you look at cities such as Portland, cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities, you already know you are dealing with all kinds of not just euphemisms, you are dealing with upendings of the Constitution. Why do I say euphemism? Because there is no provision for a sanctuary city in our Constitution. It should be known for what it is, a nullification city, a locality that wants to divorce itself from federal law. Where might that have its roots? Yes, certainly in our times, this was the cry and call of segregationists who did not want to enforce federal desegregation and civil rights laws, and Supreme Court decisions. And how did presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson deal with that? Sending in federal troops and law enforcement. What was behind the notion of nullification and resistance then, in those times? A perverted, if not perverse, view of civil rights, never mind humanity. And the leaders of those perverse views were Southern segregationist Democrats, just as the leaders of the more violent form of nullification, namely secession, had a perverse view of civil rights and humanity and our nation's founding, particularly its Declaration of Independence and Constitution. So you see, we have a massive set of problems of faction in this country, and it seems now that both its causes and effects stem from the same root, a long train of misunderstanding or really rewriting our Constitution and misunderstanding our history. Sanctuary cities or nullification of federal laws, objections to federal law enforcement, they all come with a really lousy pedigree. As usual, founded and based in issues having to do with race. And they come from the losing side of history, slavery, justifications for slavery, and segregation and the justifications for segregation. And so in the riots themselves today, as well as in the opposition to federal law enforcement to quell them, we have yet another example of left-wing invocations to the losing side of history. This is what makes it so easy for the rioters, for fun and profit, to engage in their actions, purportedly in the name of fighting racism. The problem is they have it easy because they read the wrong book and know the wrong history. Theirs is the history and book of the Confederacy and Southern segregation. Their reading of America and her founding is the Confederacy and Southern segregationists' reading and understanding of American history. Mine and ours is the book of the Union and integration. Their books were written by Roger Taney and Jefferson Davis. Their view of history is the history in the majority opinion of the Dred Scott decision. My books were written by Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Justices Curtis and McLean in the dissent of the Dred Scott decision. It is the history not only understood, but propelled by the hundreds of thousands of Americans who lost their lives fighting for that understanding between 1861 and 1865. So in conclusion, let me just say, to me, when you target the innocent or arrest or punish the wrong man, we all know that to be a horrible injustice. One might even call it a moral crime. But what happens when you indict and punish the wrong country? That, after all, is what our present rioters are doing, and it is the cause of our current faction. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.